On a cold January morning in 1661, 12 years after a king lost his head, London came to see three dead men hanged. The carts rolled slowly toward Tyburn. There were no prisoners inside, only coffins. The crowd was loud at first, then quieter the closer the procession came to the gallows. Everyone knew who was in those boxes: Oliver Cromwell, John Bradshaw, and the third man, the one most people could not quite place, the one whose name they knew only from printed lists and angry sermons: Henry Ireton. They had dug him up for this. 2 months earlier his body had been lying undisturbed in Westminster Abbey, in the same church where kings were crowned and buried. Now it was here, dragged out of the grave, nailed into a coffin and hauled through the streets like a criminal. The ropes were already hanging from the crossbeam. Someone in the crowd laughed, someone spat, someone crossed themselves quickly, not entirely sure for whom. The coffins were opened under the gallows. The corpses had been in the ground for years. They were swollen and pale, faces distorted, clothes stained and rotten. The hangmen worked with a kind of rough efficiency, gagging the mouths that would never speak again, binding the stiff arms that would never move. They slung the three bodies up on separate ropes and stepped back. For a moment there was silence. No drums, no speeches, just the sound of rope tightening and wood creaking under the weight. Cromwell swung first, Bradshaw next, then Henry Ireton, the man almost no one in the crowd could see clearly and almost no one truly understood, turned slowly in the wind while the city watched and decided that this, finally, was justice for a murdered king. If anyone there had asked why that third corpse was hanging, why it deserved to be hauled out of a royal church and humiliated in public alongside the Lord Protector himself, very few could have given an answer that went beyond a sentence. He was one of the men who killed the king. That was true. It was also nowhere near enough. To explain why Henry Ireton ended here swaying beside his father-in-law, you have to go back 16 years, to a field in Northamptonshire, to a moment when he was not a corpse and not a legend and not yet a regicide. He was just a man on a horse trying to hold a line that was about to break. The Battle of Naseby, June 1645. By mid-morning the air above the fields was smoke and dust, and the shouting of men who could not see more than 20 yards in front of them. The Parliamentary army and the King's army had smashed into each other and were grinding together in a pattern that, to anyone watching from a hill, might have looked like order, but inside it felt like being pulled under a wave. On the left flank, Henry Ireton saw it going wrong a heartbeat before it happened. The royalist cavalry opposite him, Prince Rupert's famous horse, had been waiting for a weakness. They saw it when some of Ireton's men hesitated just for a moment at the sight of the mass of riders forming up across the field. It was long enough. Rupert shouted. The royalist line dipped forward and then came on with that terrifying speed that only cavalry at full charge can produce: a wall of horses and steel and noise. Ireton had a choice and very little time to make it. He could pull back, dress his line, try to absorb the charge more cleanly. It would have been the cautious thing, the thing a man with his legal mind and habit of calculation might have done. Or he could try to hit Rupert's horse first, meet momentum with momentum, gamble everything on the idea that his men would hold their nerve and the other side would not. He spurred his horse forward and chose. The moment of impact erased the plan. It was no longer lines and formations, it was bodies and hooves and metal. Someone's pistol went off close to his ear. A horse went down just to his right, its rider flung into the legs of the cavalry behind. Ireton had his sword up, then he did not. A royalist trooper's point found the gap between his thigh and the saddle. Another blade scraped along his cheek, hot and bright. He went over sideways, the sky swung. The ground hit him harder than any man had. For a few seconds he lay there with the breath knocked out of him, the world narrowed to the taste of blood and earth in his mouth. Hooves pounded past within inches of his head. He rolled by instinct out of the path of a horse that never saw him. He tried to get up and discovered that his leg did not want to obey him. Hands grabbed him, rough and impatient. Voices shouted, not in triumph but in annoyance, because he was one more thing they had to drag out of the way while the charge continued. They hauled him to the side of the field and left him there under guard with a handful of other prisoners, leaning against a hedge, watching his own men being ridden down. From that ditch, from that low, humiliating angle, Henry Ireton saw something that most officers on that field never see in real time. He saw what his own defeat looked like. The left flank was gone. Rupert's horse tore through it and did not stop. They did what they always did when they saw the baggage wagons at the rear, heavy with plunder and food and the promise of chaos. They went after it. They left the centre of the royalist army exposed, its infantry suddenly without the cavalry that was supposed to protect its flanks. On the other side of the field, Oliver Cromwell saw exactly the same thing, but from the saddle and in reverse. He saw royalist cavalry vanish toward the baggage, saw the opening and drove his own horse straight into it. Parliamentary cavalry, the new model horse he had drilled and lectured and prayed with for months, hit the king's infantry with a controlled brutality that was nothing like Rupert's wild charge. It was slower and more deliberate and much more final. Naseby was decided in that moment. Ireton did not see the whole manoeuvre. From the hedge he saw only fragments, men running, colours falling, smoke drifting across the centre, where the king's infantry was being chewed apart. He watched the battle slip out of royalist hands and into the hands of the army he had joined. He also watched it happen without him. The pain in his leg came in waves. The cut on his face itched and burned. The guard next to him was distracted, eyes fixed on the same scene, one hand tightening and loosening on the hilt of his sword, as if he could change the outcome by gripping it harder. "Looks like you lost," the man muttered without looking at him. Ireton did not answer. There was nothing useful to say. He could see as well as anyone that the royalist centre was crumpling, that the king had been pushed back, that what had started that morning as another dangerous, uncertain day had turned, suddenly and irreversibly, into the end of something. It was not his command that had done it. It was Cromwell's. If he had been a different kind of man, it might have eaten at him. As it was, the thought that settled in his mind, cold and clear under the pain, was not envy or self-pity. It was calculation. He understood, looking at the field from the dirt, that this was the last time the king would ever have the chance to win a battle like this. Naseby was the hinge. Everything before it had been in doubt. Everything after it would be the long, messy process of deciding what to do with a beaten king. And that was the kind of problem Henry Ireton was born for. He was 33 years old. He had trained as a lawyer at the Middle Temple. He read scripture as closely as he read statutes, and he did both with the same hard, relentless attention to what words actually meant when you followed them to their conclusions. He had not come to war for glory or plunder or because he found battle attractive. He had come because he had watched Charles I govern for 15 years and had concluded that the king's understanding of law and obligation made the law itself meaningless. Unlimited royal authority was, to Ireton, not just bad policy. It was a lie told in legal language. The war was his answer to that lie. They exchanged him a few months after Naseby. Prisoners went one way, letters went the other, and Henry Ireton walked out of captivity with a limp, a scar along his cheek that never quite faded, and a sharper sense than ever that he had been given a second chance to finish something that was not yet finished at all. By the time he rejoined the army, the First Civil War was sliding toward its end. The king would surrender to the Scots. The Scots would hand him over to Parliament. Parliament would argue with itself about what to do with him. The army would watch all of this and discover, slowly and with growing anger, that the people they had been fighting for were less certain about the victory than the men who had bled to achieve it. In June 1646, in the middle of this uncertain peace, Henry Ireton married Bridget Cromwell. It was not a quiet parish wedding with time for flowers and family. It was an army marriage, contracted while the war still technically existed, even if the king's ability to prosecute it had collapsed. The ceremony took place in a world where garrisons were still manned, arrears of pay were still unpaid, and nobody knew what the country would look like in a year. The only clear fact in the room was the one that linked Ireton and Cromwell together forever. The austere, intense lawyer who argued doctrine in the officers' tents was now the son-in-law of the most feared cavalry commander in England. For Oliver Cromwell, the match brought into his family the one man in the army whose mind he trusted as much as his own, and maybe a little more. For Ireton, it anchored him in the centre of power, but it did something else as well. It tied his private loyalties to the public cause in a way that would make compromise harder, not easier. When you are bound to a man by blood, by faith, and by the outcome of a war, backing away from conclusions is not just a political act. It is a betrayal. People who met Ireton in these years did not describe him as charming. They described him as clear. When debates broke out in the army councils, when officers sat around tables in taverns and churches, arguing about pay, religion, and the future of England, the man who could slice through the fog and say, "If you believe that, then the next step is this, and the next step after that is something you are pretending not to see," was Henry Ireton. He was not loved in the way Cromwell was loved. Cromwell could weep when he spoke to his soldiers, could talk about providence and the hand of God in a way that made hard men cry along with him. Ireton did not make men cry. He made them uncomfortable because he pushed their arguments until they either broke or hardened. In the autumn of 1647 he pushed harder than ever. The army had seized the king from Parliament's custody and brought him under its own control. It was an extraordinary act, close to mutiny, and it left everyone involved with a set of questions for which English history had no precedents. Could an army, claiming to represent the people, hold the King of England as a prisoner and demand new terms for how the kingdom would be governed? If so, who in that army had the right to speak for England? The debates at Putney were an attempt to answer that in public. They met in St. Mary's Church, wooden benches dragged into rough circles, officers in plain coats and breastplates, radical agitators in simpler clothes, everyone armed with Bibles, pamphlets, and a sense that they were stepping out into territory where the old language of loyalty and obedience simply did not cover the ground anymore. On one side, the Levellers. Their spokesman, Colonel Thomas Rainsborough, was blunt and brave and impatient. "The poorest he that is in England," he said, his voice carrying under the church roof, "hath a life to live as the greatest he." To him, that meant The poorest man should have a say in choosing the parliament that governed him. Life was the stake. That was enough. On the other side of the argument, Henry Ireton, he did not shout. He did not match Rainsborough's rhetoric. He picked up the words and examined them. "If you say," he replied, "that because a man lives, he must therefore have an equal voice in the choosing of those who shall govern, then you must also say that no man may engage his property by any contract. For another man who has no property may, by his vote, undo that contract without loss to himself." Underneath the theology in the 17th century phrasing, the point was simple. Power had to be tied to responsibility. Responsibility, in Ireton's mind, was tied to property. Break that link, give the vote to men with nothing to lose, and you had torn up the fabric that made law possible. You were trading a kingdom under law for a kingdom under appetite. Rainsborough stared at him. Ireton stared back. They did not agree. They never would. What matters about Putney, more than the detail of who was right, is that it shows Ireton doing in public what he would soon do in private, and then, on a national stage, he took principles seriously enough to follow them to their end. He believed, was absolutely convinced, that a nation could not survive if its basic covenants were treated as negotiable. Oaths, contracts, promises given in public and written down were not flexible to him. They were the spine of the Commonwealth. Once you allowed men with power to treat their own word as a tool rather than a bond, everything else collapsed. In the autumn of 1647, that belief still applied to Parliament, to the army, to the future constitution. He had not yet applied it to the king. That change began quietly and invisibly to him, on an island in the Solent, where Charles I was sitting in a castle, lifting a loose stone from his fireplace and hiding a document that would reach Henry Ireton months later and lock his thinking into a position from which he would never again retreat. At that moment in Carisbrooke Castle, the king was doing what he always did. He was negotiating in one room and plotting in another. He was speaking words to one set of men and writing different words to different men. He was promising Parliament that he would accept limits on his authority, while promising the Scots that he would give them what Parliament would not. 3 years of Presbyterian church government in England, the suppression of the religious radicals in the army, and his own signature on the very covenant he had spent years resisting. He folded the treaty. He put it under the hearthstone. He let the fire burn above it. When Ireton finally saw the text of that agreement, when news of the engagement reached the army and the letters were read, and the pattern of the king's behaviour became not just a suspicion, but a document in his hands, the reaction among the officers was not simple outrage. It was recognition. They had always suspected that Charles was playing a double game. Now they had proof that he was playing 3 or 4 at once. For some, that meant he was an untrustworthy man who would need stricter terms next time. For others, it meant Parliament had to be more careful. For Henry Ireton, it meant something else. If oaths and contracts were the spine of the Commonwealth, what do you do with a man whose entire political life has been a sequence of broken oaths and tactical contracts? You can try again. You can negotiate harder. You can limit him on paper. You can build structures around him like a cage. Or you can admit finally that the problem is not the cage, it is the man inside it. That conclusion did not arrive in him with a burst of anger. It settled in like a verdict in a difficult case. He was a lawyer. He knew the difference between suspicion and proof. The engagement was proof, and once he had it in his hands, Henry Ireton, the king's subject, the king's prisoner at Naseby, The king's reluctant enemy began to see a path that did not end with a new treaty. It ended with a scaffold. 16 years later, his body would hang beside Cromwell's at Tyburn, dug out of consecrated ground and offered up to the crowd as a symbol of monstrous ingratitude and the crime of killing a king. In 1647, he was a scarred man in his mid-30s, newly married, limping slightly when he was tired, sitting in councils and churches and cramped rooms with candles burning low, reading and rereading the king's secret promises to his enemies, and understanding that if words like that were allowed to stand unanswered, then nothing written in England meant anything at all. He was not yet the man in the rope. But the rope was already there, invisible and waiting, at the end of the line he had just stepped onto. The first time Henry Ireton told men who had almost died for England that they did not deserve a voice in its future, you could have heard a pin drop on the church floor. It was late October 1647. St. Mary's Church at Putney smelled of damp wool, candle smoke, and wet earth, tracked in on boots. Outside, the rain had come in sideways off the Thames and turned the churchyard to mud. Inside, the pews had been pushed back, and the place of Sunday sermons had become something no English parish church had ever held before. An army arguing with itself, officers sat at rough tables in their buff coats and breastplates, swords buckled at their sides, even here, in a house of God. Mixed among them were men who, in any other army in Europe, would have been flogged for speaking their minds. They wore plainer coats, some still spattered with the brown stains of old blood. They had been elected by their regiments and called themselves agitators. Their job was to bring the anger of the ranks to the men who commanded them. On the table in the middle of the room lay a bundle of papers, heavy with wet ink and dangerous hope. The agreement of the people. It was thin as an object, thick as an idea. It said that parliaments should be regular and accountable. It said that parliamentary seats should be fairly divided. And it said, in lines that made older men's stomachs tighten, that almost every man in England should have a vote, not just landowners, not just freeholders, every man who lived under English law. Thomas Rainsborough, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the blunt confidence of someone who had led men into fire and come back out, stood up and put his hand flat on the pages as if he were swearing to them. I truly think, he said, looking straight at the officers' table, that the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live as the greatest he, and therefore, truly, sir, I think it is clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first, by his own consent, to put himself under that government. It hit the room like a musket shot. Some of the junior men grinned openly. One or two thumped the table with the flat of their hands once, before remembering where they were. An older colonel closed his eyes briefly, as if someone had just walked across his father's grave. All eyes went to Henry Ireton. He did not stand up right away. He sat with his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, the scar on his cheek a pale line in the candlelight, watching the words hang in the air. The poorest he that is in England, a life to live as the greatest he. He had spent his adult life thinking about what lives meant when they collided with law, about what happened when people who made promises treated those promises like breath on a cold morning. He had watched a king use his coronation oath like a shield when it suited him and like a cloak to be thrown off when it did not. Now he was listening to a man he respected suggest that simple existence entitled you to equal power. He stood. I do not deny, he began, voice even, that every man hath a life to live and liberties common to all Englishmen. If that were the question, we should soon agree. He let the first sentence soothe the room for a heartbeat. Then he put the edge back in. But you say that because a man lives under a government, he must therefore have an equal voice in choosing that government. I must tell you, if that be admitted as a principle, it dissolves all property. He saw the flinch, small but there, in the faces of men who had estates and mortgages and rents to collect. If I, he went on, having an estate, engage it by some contract for the public good, and there be 20 men who have no estate at all, yet who, by your rule, must have an equal voice in making law, then these 20 may vote to break the agreement I have made. They lose nothing. I lose what is mine. Where is the justice that a man who hath nothing shall by his vote dispose of that which another hath honestly gotten and engaged? A murmur went through the church. One of the agitators, Sexby, half rose from his bench. Then it seems, he said loudly, that we fought only for those that have estates. I never heard that an estate made a man English. A couple of men barked rough laughter. It died quickly under the weight of the room's attention. Ireton looked at Sexby as if measuring him, then answered, still calm. You mistake me. I do not say that men without estates are no Englishmen. I say that if you make possession of a life the only title to a voice in government, you give power to those who have no fixed interest in the peace of this kingdom. They may vote today for one thing, tomorrow for another. Their condition binds them to nothing. If law may be altered at their pleasure, how shall any man know what his contract means from 1 year to the next? He was not thundering. He was dissecting. That was what made it worse. He was not dismissing the poor. He was telling men who had risked everything that their risk still did not entitle them to the same say as their landlords. It hurt because he meant it. Rainsborough took a step closer to the table, shoulders tight. If a man, he said, must be bound by laws which he had no hand in choosing, I do not see that he is a free man. I did not hear, when we took up arms, that we were fighting for a property in a few men's hands. I heard that we were fighting for Englishmen's rights, and that the poorest man had as much of a right to live free as the greatest lord. The words echoed off stone. Somewhere near the back, someone whispered, Amen. Cromwell, sitting a little apart, rubbed a hand over his face. He had seen this coming from the moment the men marched into the church. He was watching not just a debate, but a fault line opening under the army he needed to hold together. Friends, he began, half rising, we must consider. Ireton did not sit down. As for freedom, he said, cutting across the attempt to smooth things over, if you will have it, that no man is free unless he hath an equal voice in choosing those that govern, then no man can be under any obligation he hath not himself chosen. A son may cast off his father, a servant his master, a subject his magistrate. There is an end to all bonds. I say that the liberty of a man to enjoy what is his by law is as much a liberty as the liberty to choose those who make that law, and if you give one without measure, you destroy the other. He did not shout the last words, but they landed like blows. To the men who heard him, it was a kind of heresy. In a war fought in the name of liberty, he was arguing for limits on who could exercise it. He was daring to tell men with pike scars on their arms that their blood did not automatically buy them the vote. He saw their faces, the hurt, the anger, the confusion. He did not look away. There were easier ways to be popular in that church. He could have wrapped himself in Rainsborough's line about the poorest man and pleased the men who might one day carry him on their shoulders. He could have hidden his conclusions under softer words. He did not. He would not blink. The debate rolled on for hours, then days. Other voices joined in. Some tried to find a middle way. Narrow the franchise, perhaps, but widen it more than before. Give the vote to more men, but not all. Draw a new line somewhere between land and life. Ireton kept coming back to the same cold point. If your principles destroy the ability to keep promises, they are not principles that can govern a nation. Outside Putney, news drifted in like smoke. Parliament was still haggling with the king. The City of London was jittery. Radical pamphlets passed from hand to hand, promising a world turned upside down. The Scots muttered and watched. The country groped for a new equilibrium and found only more arguments. Inside the church, Henry Ireton sat late after the sessions ended, running ink-stained fingers along the edges of the agreement's pages. Once, alone with Cromwell in a quiet moment between debates, he tapped a finger on the title. "They will not have what they want," he said, "not as they want it. This breaks too much." Cromwell sighed. "They think," he answered, "that God hath given them a right because they have borne the burden of the day, and, in part, I cannot deny them. Yet if we break the old frame all at once, I do not see where we stand." "Then we must say it," Ireton replied, "not hide it in phrases. Either we believe a man's property binds him to the kingdom in a way that mere living does not, or we do not. If we do, then we cannot promise them this agreement. If we do not, then we have confessed that everything we have defended by law these years past was a mistake." He spoke without heat. That was what made it cut. Cromwell looked at his son-in-law for a long moment, then away. "Words are not bullets, Henry," he said quietly. "We may wound each other with them and have nothing mended." "Words are all we have," Ireton answered. "If they mean nothing, then bullets are all that will ever be left." He was thinking of more than the Levellers when he said it. He was thinking of a king who had spoken words in Parliament in 1641, promising to respect the law, and then stretched those laws whenever it suited him. Of treaties made and unmade, of oaths given before God and then treated as tactics. He did not yet know the exact content of the engagement. The king's hearthstone was still in place on the Isle of Wight. The ink on that separate promise to the Scots was still drying under the fire. But every instinct in him said that men who used language like Charles used language could not be brought to heel with softer versions of the same thing. For all his resistance to the Levellers, he and they shared one conviction. Words were not decorations, they were bonds. Break enough of them, and you did not just lose trust in a man, you lost trust in the very idea of contract. The debates at Putney were suspended in November. There were mutinous murmurs in some regiments. Parliament tried to reassert control over the army. The officers moved to head off a split. The agreement of the people went back into its bundle of papers, not forgotten, not adopted, hovering over everything like a storm that might yet break. Ireton rode away from Putney with more enemies in the ranks than when he had arrived. He knew it. He accepted it. He had chosen to be feared as a man who would tell you where your principles actually led, rather than loved as a man who told you what you wanted to hear. For a few weeks it still seemed possible that the settlement he wanted could be made. Parliament would finalise terms. The king, tired and cornered, would accept them. The army would be paid and disbanded. A reformed monarchy would sit within a new legal frame, its teeth pulled, its claws trimmed. Then the rumours hardened into fact. Scottish commissioners had indeed been visiting the Isle of Wight. They had not just been exchanging pious hopes and vague courtesies. They had been negotiating. There was talk of a treaty, of an army to come, of promises made in one room while other promises were being spoken in another. When the text of the engagement finally lay on a table before Henry Ireton, There were no witnesses to the moment, no choir, no thunderclap, just a man, a candle, a sheet of paper, and a silence that grew heavier with each line he read. 3 years of Presbyterianism in England, suppression of the independent congregations, the king's vow to take the covenant he had rejected for a decade and a half. In return, a Scottish army raised to march into England and cut down the very soldiers who had, 3 years before, at Naseby, given the king his life instead of finishing him on the field. His eyes went back to one phrase and stayed there. He promises. The pen strokes were neat, the words confident. They looked like law. He remembered, without meaning to, standing in a courtroom as a younger man, listening to a judge deliver a ruling that had twisted the petition of right into something Charles could live with. He remembered the hollow feeling as he realized that text could be bent by power until it meant its opposite. He held the engagement in his hands and felt the same hollowing. He did not slam his fist on the table. He did not tear the paper in half. That was not his way. The one visible betrayal of his composure, noticed later by the one clerk who came in with more correspondence, was small and almost ridiculous. The quill by his hand snapped between his fingers. The clerk saw him look at the broken nib as if surprised to find it there, then lay it down very carefully beside the treaty and reach, with deliberate calm, for another pen. "Is it as bad as they say, sir?" the clerk asked, before he could stop himself. "It is worse," Ireton said, without looking up. "It is exactly as I expected." He dipped the new pen in ink. In that moment something in him crossed a line. After Putney he had still believed that the right document, the right words, could cage a king. After the engagement he understood that no cage made of words could hold a man who treated every promise as a bridge to be burned once he had crossed it. The Levellers had terrified him because they wanted to tear down the old framework of obligation. The king terrified him more because he had spent his reign using that framework as a mask. If oaths and contracts were the spine of the Commonwealth, what do you do with the man whose hands are on every fracture? You can take his powers. You can surround him with counsels. You can write documents that bind his successors tighter. Or you can admit finally that the law itself cannot survive while he is there to bend it. That thought did not come with anger. It came with the cold certainty of a man who had looked at an argument from every side and found that, however he turned it, it pointed in only one direction. Others in the army felt the betrayal and wanted new terms, firmer guarantees, another attempt. Henry Ireton picked up the broken quill again, weighed it in his palm, and then dropped it into the fire. Some promises, he had decided, could not be mended. They had to be answered, not with another treaty, but with something England had never seen. A court, a charge, and, at the end of it, a sentence that would put the one man who thought himself above all law under the only judgment he could not talk his way out of. By the time Henry Ireton began to write the paper that would kill a king, he had already buried one war and watched a second crawl out of its grave. The first, Civil War, had ended the way stories are supposed to end, a great battle, a beaten king, negotiations, a kingdom exhausted, ready to be stitched back together. Men went home with scars and arrears and a belief that the worst was behind them. Then Wales rose, Kent rose, Essex rose. The Scots crossed the border with an army raised on promises that had been hidden under a hearthstone. And the same men who had stacked their pikes against cottage walls and tried to remember how to be husbands and fathers put their swords back on and marched again. Not with the hot First War conviction of 1642, but with a flat, burnt-out anger that this was happening at all. From a distance, 1648 looked like a series of efficient military operations. The new model army moved with its usual precision. Castles were reduced, towns were taken, fields were won. Up close, it felt like a verdict. We tried mercy. It did not work. Every small grave dug in 1648, every ditch where 2 or 3 bodies were laid, because there was no time for anything better, lay at the end of a chain that began with ink on a page in Carisbrooke Castle. The officers knew it. They gathered at Windsor in April, in chambers that had seen kings crowned and feasted, but not this. A group of tired, hard-faced men kneeling on stone floors, voices breaking as they tried to explain to God and to each other what they thought had just happened. It was not a formal council. There were no resolutions. They read scripture, they prayed, they talked, they laid the years out like evidence. A king who had ruled without parliament, a king who had signed the petition of right and then treated it as decoration, a king who had levied war on his own people, been beaten, been spared, and then, while under guard, promised one army of his enemies to destroy another. They had been slow to believe the worst of him. Many in that room had wanted a settlement that left him alive and limited. Some still did. They spoke of David sparing Saul, of mercy, of the dangers of touching the Lord's anointed. But the Second Civil War would not leave them alone with their comforting verses. At some point during those days, someone used a phrase from their Bible. It did not land with weight at first. It came in as one more line of scripture among many. Man of blood. The words were simple in their world, they were lethal. A man of blood was not just someone who had shed blood. He was someone on whom that blood rested as a charge that could not be ignored. A king who had brought war onto his own people again and again had stepped into that category. Henry Ireton did not seize on the phrase immediately. He listened to it as it was turned over, tested, prayed through. He listened to officers weep as they admitted that if they kept patching things over, they were agreeing to carry the weight of other men's deaths. He listened and felt something in him that had already cracked under the engagement settle into its final shape. If Charles was a man of blood, then the question was no longer how to bind him. It was whether they dared to leave him alive. After Windsor, the army did what armies do. It went back to work. Cromwell rode to Wales and then north, smashing the Engager army at Preston in a campaign whose speed would have been unbelievable from anyone but him. Other generals broke the risings in Kent and Essex. Colchester held out until starvation did what Cannon could not. Pembroke fell. The Scottish invasion, built on the promises Charles had buried under his fireplace, lasted 6 weeks from border to ruin. When the fighting stopped, the officers went back to London carrying not flags and trophies, but something heavier. They had asked God what all this meant. They had not liked the answer. Parliament did not want to hear it. While the army prayed at Windsor and bled in Lancashire, the House of Commons had been doing what it had done since the first shots of the war, talking to the king. The Newport negotiations were, on paper, the most far-reaching yet. Charles offered more than he had ever offered before. He promised parliamentary control of the militia for 20 years. He accepted church reforms he had once resisted. He agreed to limitations on the very prerogatives that he had treated as untouchable at the start of his reign. To men in Westminster who had always believed that the war was about constitutional balance, this looked like vindication. We have, at last, brought him to reason. To men in the army who had read the engagement with the Scots and buried its consequences, it looked like something else entirely. We are doing it again. We are pretending that the right words on the right kind of paper can make a man into something He has spent his life proving he is not. Henry Ireton watched Parliament vote to continue talking to the king as if none of the engagements, none of the graves, none of the prayers at Windsor existed. There was a strain at his temples that had not been there in Putney. The scar on his cheek, caught by the light when he turned his head, looked deeper. He had one skill that mattered now more than ever. He could take muddled anger and vague conviction and turn them into sentences that did not let the men who read them escape from their own conclusions. In November 1648 he sat down to do exactly that. The room in which he worked was not grand. A table, 2 chairs, a fire that smoked more than it warmed, a stack of foolscap, a pot of ink. Outside the window, London was a winter city, damp, grey, alive with rumours that smelled of coal smoke and fear. He dipped his pen and began to draft what would become the Remonstrance of the Army. It did not open with fury. It opened like a case. First, he described the wars. He set down in ordered lines how the king had repeatedly taken up arms against his own parliament and people, how he had called in foreign forces, how he had used negotiations as cover for new preparations. He did not appeal to feelings. He appealed to memory. Then he moved to Parliament. He reminded the Commons of how often they had failed to act when action was required, of their backsliding, of their tendency to treat the king's words as if they had not heard his deeds. There was no flattery in it. There was a weary, precise disappointment. Only after he had built that foundation did he lay down the thing that made the room around him, when he read it aloud later, go very still, that for these causes, and for the blood thus shed, there must be justice, and that if the existing Parliament would not seek it, then there must be another authority raised that would, and that justice, to be justice, must reach even to the king. The Remonstrance did not yet say in so many words, put Charles Stuart on trial for his life. But the direction of travel was obvious. The army was no longer asking nicely. It was no longer content with being told to stand down, to be paid, to go home and leave the hard questions to gentlemen in wigs. It was saying, we have a duty, and we will not duck it because it frightens you. When Ireton brought his draft to the Council of Officers, they did not rush to embrace it. The paper lay on the table between them, ink still drying in places. Men who had fought shoulder to shoulder leaned forward to read phrases that would make them traitors if the wrong side came out on top. One of the older colonels, his hair gone mostly grey under his hat, cleared his throat. If we do this, he said, if we set ourselves against both king and parliament, there is no law left but what we make with our own hands. We will be called rebels by all the world. We are already called rebels by all the world, Ireton said quietly. The question is not what they call us. It is whether we can live with what we know and do nothing. The colonel's jaw tightened. I did not take up arms, he shot back, to sit as judge over him that God set above me. And I, Ireton answered, the calm fraying at the edges for the first time anyone could remember, did not take up arms to see the law of God, and man made into a net that catches only the small fish. If he may make war at his pleasure, and we, knowing it, suffer him to sit again, and do it a third time, then the blood that follows is ours as much as his. The words hung there. Cromwell was not at that table. He was still outside Pontefract, overseeing a siege that had stretched on so long it felt like a bad parable, but his presence was there in the minds of every man. They all knew that nothing this radical would move without him. They also knew that he was a man who could hesitate at the edge of something new and terrible. Ireton was not trying to push him into madness. He was trying to remove the last excuses that allowed him not to see where the path already led. Over the next days, the remonstrance was revised, smoothed, sharpened. Other officers suggested changes. Some asked that language condemning Parliament be softened. Others wanted the army's religious demands made more explicit. Ireton listened, accepted some phrases, rejected others, but protected the spine of the document with a kind of cold ferocity. The king must be brought to account. If Parliament would not do it, it forfeited its claim to be the proper instrument. And the army, having been the means by which God had delivered the king into England's hands, could not in conscience hand him back wrapped in paper. When Cromwell finally rode into London and took the remonstrance in hand, the story that later went around was that he paced the room as he read, sometimes stopping short, sometimes groaning, sometimes throwing himself into a chair in agony over what was being asked. He had built his public life on the idea that he was not making events but following God's providence through them. Now, Providence, in the form of his son-in-law's closely reasoned sentences, was standing in front of him with a hand on his chest, saying, "This is as far as you can pretend you have not chosen." He did not sign the remonstrance with his own hand. It was not that kind of paper. But he did something more important. He did not suppress it. He allowed it to be presented to Parliament. When the Commons received it in late November, the reaction was exactly what Ireton had expected and feared. They debated it. They voted, not on its substance, but on whether they should consider it at all. They chose, in the end, to pretend that nothing had changed. They renewed their negotiation with the king at Newport. They went back to the man of blood with an inkpot. If the remonstrance had been the last step, if it had simply been rejected and left to sit in some clerk's pile, history might have gone another way. But ideas, once spoken, rarely stay on paper. On the 6th of December, Colonel Thomas Pride stood at the door of the House of Commons, with a list in his hand and armed men behind him. Members who had voted to continue negotiating with the king were stopped as they tried to enter. Some were turned away. Some were seized and led off. Those who got in found their benches half empty. It looked, in the moment, like a simple act of brute force. It was that. It was also the remonstrance made flesh. The army had told Parliament what justice required. Parliament had refused. The army responded, not with another petition, but with a purge. When word of Pride's action reached Ireton, someone who was there later remembered that he did not smile. He went very still, as if listening to a sound only he could hear. "Then we have burned the last bridge," the man said, more to himself than to anyone else. "There were no bridges left," Ireton answered. "Only the fog that made us think so." The rump parliament that remained after the purge moved quickly, partly from conviction, partly from shock, and partly because the bayonets outside the chamber left it little room to drift. An ordinance was passed to create a High Court of Justice. It had never existed before. There was no precedent, no ancient statute to invoke. The Lords refused to agree. The king, obviously, did not assent. The Commons alone declared that they would constitute a court to try Charles Stuart, King of England. It was one thing to write a paper calling a man of blood to account. It was another to write the charge that would be read to his face. Ireton sat again, with pen and paper, this time with less time, more pressure, and the knowledge that what he wrote now would not just be argued in a council room. It would be heard in Westminster Hall under the high hammer-beam roof where kings had feasted, where English law had been displayed as something solid and ancient. He chose his words with the same cold care he had always shown. Tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation. He tested each term against what he knew. Tyrant, a ruler who uses power not for the good of his people but for his own will. Charles had levied war. He had ruled without law, the word fit. Traitor, a man who betrays the trust placed in him. A king's trust was his coronation oath and the safety of his people. Charles had broken both. Murderer. He had not swung sword or fired musket, but he had set wars in motion, twice. In Ireton's mind, the command and the act were inseparable. Public enemy. Not a foreign invader, but a danger inside the body of the nation itself. He wrote the words slowly, pausing between them, not because he doubted their logic, but because he understood, in a way few men ever have to, that each stroke of the pen was tightening a rope that would eventually be laid across a block. Once, alone in the room with the draft, he read the key sentence aloud under his breath. Charles Stuart hath been and is a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation. His voice did not shake. What betrayed him, again, was his hand. The pen dug a fraction too hard into the paper, leaving a dark blot where the word murderer ended. He stared at it for a long moment, then drew a neat line through the spot and rewrote the word beside it, cleaner, as if refusing to let his own hesitation make the charge ugly. Someone who came in later for his signature found him sitting with the finished indictment in front of him, one hand resting lightly on the page, as if he were holding it down. "Is it done, sir?" the man asked. "It is begun," Ireton said. In the weeks that followed, men would argue that the court had no legal foundation, that a parliament without lords and king could not create a tribunal to try the king himself. They would say that the law did not know how to do this. Henry Ireton's answer, written not as a slogan but as a set of careful, relentless sentences, was that the law had always known how to call a murderer to account. It had simply never before been allowed to look this high. He had spent years insisting that words bound men. Now he had written words that bound him. If the trial failed, if the king walked free, if the tide turned, and the old order slammed back into place, there was no world in which Henry Ireton would be treated as a misguided negotiator. He would be hanged, if they were merciful. He wrote anyway, because in his mind the choice was no longer between safety and danger, or even between peace and renewed war. It was between living in a country where the man who had caused 2 civil wars could sit on his throne and talk of his sacred person, and living in a country where even a king could be made to hear the words tyrant, traitor, murderer, public enemy read to his face. He had taken a scar for the First War. He was prepared to take a rope for the Second. January 30th, 1649, Westminster Hall. Charles Stuart stood in the dock, black velvet shot with silk, hair dressed perfect, gloves adjusted calm as Clarke read words Henry Ireton wrote. Charles Stuart, King of England, hath been and is a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation. Hall silent under hammer-beam roof. 59 commissioners watched, some soldiers, some civilians. Hands shook different degrees signing ordinance. One signed twice. One wept open, most rigid, not judging man, rewriting power grammar. Ireton sat among them, scar caught, winter light, watched King's face, searched one thing never seen, honesty. Charles argued procedure, court no standing, parliament minus lords king, no judge king, no statute allowed. Right, strict English law sense, not old rules courtroom. Ireton's rules. Trial 1 week. Charles refused plead, refused recognise court, spoke sacred office, divine right. Trust God, people. Dignified. Convincing. King's answer, heaven believers. Unassailable. Buried his choices, men, talking truth around. Last day, January 27th, sentence, death. Charles heard, no change, led away. Commissioners sat afternoon, stared floor, whispered, thought warrants. Ireton signed, no hesitation. Ink, no blot. Hand, no shake. 3 days later, scaffold ready. Charles walked banqueting house, past Rubens' ceiling, father painted, past crowd soldiers held. 2 shirts cold, spoke brief. Innocence, office, injustice. Head block, axe fell once clean. Crowd saw body head separate. Groaned one, England no king. Ireton watched distance arranged. Not triumph, door closing. Done what set out. Man blood gone. Cycle war negotiation betrayal. War broken. Believed. Army indemnity. Parliament purged compliant. Build new. Religious toleration secure. Constitution rewrite. No dead weight. Man treated, promise disposable. Turned scaffold. Backwork. Work never stopped. Commonwealth establish. Council, state organise. Foreign ambassadors answer. Horrified, some quiet, impressed. Pamphlets, London called, regicides, monsters, beasts, antichrist, precursors. Read. Filed. Kept writing. May 1650, sailed Ireland. Ireland civil wars loose end. Royalists pockets. Catholic Confederates south. Commonwealth no settled half-island war. Second command father-in-law. Cromwell main force. Ireton logistics, siegecraft. Grind castles, towns refused surrender. Limerick hardest. Walls thick laughed cannon garrison stubborn. Civilians 8 horses leather worse. Outside Ireton men waited. Winter sucked mud ground. 38. Scar 12 years. Work suited. Methodical relentless break resistance outlasted reason. Autumn 1651. Siege second-year fever hit English camp. Started camp followers. Soldiers, trenches, officers. Cromwell left England before full. Delegated final push Ireton. November. Henry Ireton sick. Worked through. Dictated bed. Met engineers breach. Wrote Bridget Cromwell Council. London supply walls. State. 26th. Called Bible. No theatrics, illness, health, no deathbed speeches, grand summaries. Book carried 2 wars, open psalms, died night. 39, 2 years scaffold, not battle, not axe rope, flux fever, Irish siege camp, wet earth, gunpowder nose, no crowds, no drums, few officers, candles, rough coffin, buried first, Limerick Street, Mary's Cathedral, stone floor, word London, Cromwell wept, Council State funeral, spring 1652. Body home, Westminster Abbey received, Church Kings lay, nave, Charles, crowned. Tomb simple honourable, black marble inscription service, Commonwealth. 11 years later, Cromwell Death Protectorate staggered, fell army splintered country monarchy bells, rang bonfires burned, regicides, hunted. Henry Ireton, every list. January 1661, 12 years exact scaffold. Whitehall 3 coffins left Abbey. Cromwell's, Bradshaw's, Ireton's. Pride open pale, Tyburn sky. Bodies 11 years ground grotesque. Swollen blackened clothes, rotted rags. Hangmen quick professional disgust. Bound arms, gagged mouths, ropes, crossbeam. Crowd near silence, coffins swung. Cromwell first. Bradshaw next. Henry Ireton turned slow rope. Face distorted. Body knelt. Northamptonshire mud stood unblinking. Putney Church swayed city. Decided justice crime. Man turned graves indictments arguments warrants. King's sacred person charge began tyrant. Paid twice. Life Limerick mud. Corpse 12 years pen sent man block. History remembers Cromwell held axe. Ireton sharpened. Ireton turned engagement secret paper. Reason 5,000 died. Ireton sat. Church's councils wrote de line. Line argument. Mercy man. Blood no mercy. Cromwell hesitated. Wept. Prayed light. Ireton saw light. Pointed walked unblinking step. Destroyed king. New king. Destroyed back. Rope Tyburn creaked wind. Crowd drifted. Henry Ireton hung alone. Man thought words remake nation end wordless justice never imagined picked pen. War over. England's not.